Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for the very kind and nice introduction and for the friendship. And thank you, Jonathan, for the invitation, and Nick, and also to the Elliott School for hosting us. Alison, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you about some topics and some views about science and technology in Brazil. That is, about how Brazil has been organizing its science and technology. In the present day, in Brazil, it is almost mandatory to add innovation to that. So you have to say science, technology, and innovation. How Brazil has been organizing this activity, and with a special mention to what I called here in the title subnational initiatives. Brazil is a federative republic. We have 26 states and a federal district. And the way things evolved in Brazil, initiatives by the states became very important and very relevant in shaping the national science and technology policy. So I'm going to talk to you about the interplay between those two ways of organizing a policy in a federative country. I will start by describing to you some context about science and technology in Brazil, how some actions that shaped this policy have evolved, and then mention some results and challenges, of which I can probably advance here that probably the most important, the most difficult challenge for Brazil is that of inequality. Inequality in all senses. Brazil is a very heterogeneous country. There are rich regions, there are poor regions, and it is very difficult, especially if you have scarce or finite resources, to deal with those, with inequality and with progress, with development. So it's always what is on the table of public administrator in Brazil always is this decision, how to balance those things. And then I'll pass on to describe to you some state-level initiatives, focusing mostly on what has been done in the state of São Paulo, which is the state that has pioneered initiatives related to higher education, science, technology, and innovation, as I said in the beginning, and then go to a conclusion. So just to start, Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. It has a population of 200 million people, and it is either the 7th or the 6th economy in the world by GDP, depends on the year. It's a strongly industrialized country. It's also a country in which agriculture is very important for the economy and important for the world, because Brazil exports food to many, many countries in the world. In Brazil, the policies for science and technology have some landmarks, of which I have chosen 5, 6 to mention here, which is just to mention that the organization of science and technology policies in Brazil started after the Second World War, which is actually not something different from what happened in most countries in the world, right? Before the World War, governments had some initiatives related to science and technology and research, but mostly scientists would do research by getting money from rich people. And then after the war, governments understood that there might be some power in science. Of course, with the radar and the atomic bomb, that made it very easy for anyone to understand that science might be relevant. So Brazil started to discuss the organization, and in 1951, Brazil organized the National Research Council, which in Portuguese would be CNPq, Conselho Nacional de Pesquisas. which became an important organization until today in Brazil, funding research. So it would be the Brazilian parallel to NSF in the United States. Then also in 1951, Brazilian government organized an agency associated to the Ministry of Education, which had the mission to train personnel who would be faculty, or to foster the training of personnel who would be faculty in the growing universities in Brazil. Brazil needed university professors. We did not have any, or had a small number. And then this organization, it's a coordination for the qualification of higher education personnel, again, CAPES as it's known until today, was organized to establish a system of graduate schools in Brazil, which they did in an efficient way. Until today, CAPES has a very important role in Brazil because each one of the graduate courses in Brazil is subject every 3 or 4 years to an evaluation which is led by CAPES, and they are rated. And it's not only that they are rated, they can get more funding if they are better rated. They get less funding if they are less better rated, so they try to be well rated. The trouble is that when you have ratings, people always learn how to maximize the numbers without doing what you want them to do. So you have to change the way you rate every now and then until they learn how to maximize without actually doing what they are supposed to do. And then in 1962, the state of São Paulo created the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, where I work, which is similar to the National Research Council of Brazil, or NSF here, only it's limited in its action to the state, because it's funded by the taxpayer on the state. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. Then in 1967, Brazil organized a third national agency for funding research called FINEP, which is actually a state-owned company which has a fund to support research. Initially, it was in universities. Now it is mostly geared towards industrial innovation. They fund companies to develop research and development projects that will lead to more competitivity in those companies. Then in 1969, the Brazilian government organized what was called the National Science and Technology Fund, which is a fund which is operated by FINEP. So it's a national fund which is fed by either the federal budget or other incomes that Brazil organized in the 90s, which they call fundos setoriais, sectoral funds. And this fund provides money for FINEP to fund industrial innovation. And then there are several initiatives which I will nominate each one, but since 1934 is a relevant date in Brazil because it's when the state of São Paulo created the University of São Paulo, which became the most important university in Brazil. It's one of the important research universities in the world. It's a university that now graduates 2,300 PhDs every year. So it's a large academic operation in all fields. In 1934, the state government in São Paulo brought a delegation of French scientists to Brazil to start the University of São Paulo, to tell them, they asked, how should we organize a university? And then those French scientists came and helped us to do that. That was the first time Brazil did that. The second time was in the 40s when the Ministry of Aeronautics in Brazil brought a delegation from MIT to create an engineering school, ITA, Instituto Tecnológico de Aeronáutica, which became the birthplace of Embraer, which is a relevant aeronautics company in Brazil. So that's all parts of this policy of creating universities and research institutions from started in 1934 and then until 1985. They created 50 universities. And very important was that in 1960, the state of São Paulo created a system of full-time professorships, because before then professors were, I mean, you would go to the university for 3 hours to teach a class and go back to your engineering office or law office. There was no real academic life at the university. With the full-time jobs, then the universities started to have real academic strength. That's a very short bird's view of it. And more recently, Brazil has been doing some initiatives which, as I said before, relate to connecting science to innovation. That is, one of the big challenges in Brazil is how to better, and I think everywhere in the world, how to better connect taxpayer-funded science to shorter-term economic progress. Because everybody kind of believes that if you fund research in the long term, there will be benefits. But now in the world, there is a lot of pressure for having benefits before the long term. So in Brazil too, they want to have benefits before the long term. So Brazil organized a number of initiatives, of which an important one was a law which was passed by Congress. It was called the Innovation Law, which stipulated several procedures for example, connecting universities to industry, allowed the government to subsidize research done in industry under certain conditions, which was something forbidden before, established the general rules for academic intellectual property and how universities would work to license IP. So it would be in this chapter, it's like the, what was the name of the law here, the important one for IP? Bayh-Dole, yeah, the Bayh-Dole. It was more or less like a Bayh-Dole 15 years later. And for fostering industrial research. Then, lately, the government has enacted several types of what they call industrial and technology policy. Brazil had a period of time in recent years in which they adopted this idea of having industrial policy. That is, the government would protect or foster certain sectors of the economy to have them develop more, with mixed results, right? But there were some results through those policies which were enacted, especially after 2003 in Brazil. And then there are the initiatives by the states in Brazil, each one of the states. Just to summarize, how is the research and development landscape in Brazil? There is what became a strong academic base. Brazil graduates 15,000 PhDs every year, and this has been a growing number for the last years. Scientists in Brazil are authors to about 40,000 scientific articles which are published in international journals. And, of course, there are challenges related to increasing impact of the science, reducing geographic concentration, because most of this happens in 3 states in the southeast of Brazil. Brazil has 26 states, so it happens in São Paulo, in Rio, and in Minas Gerais. Actually, half of the science comes from the state of São Paulo. 40% of the PhDs are graduated in the state of São Paulo. So it would be badly comparing, but it's like in proportion to what happens in California here in the United States. There's a lot of science funding there, a lot of higher education. There's a strong concentration. But in Brazil, it's even more concentrated than what happens here. And there is this challenge of developing more international collaborations in research and in higher education. And there is a growing intensity of industrial research and development in Brazil. There are some companies which have relevant R&D efforts. Those are 3 of them, but there are many more. But the thing is that it's not something which is generally spread in the industrial texture of Brazil. It's growing, but it's still rare for a company to have an R&D department. in Brazil. And when they have, the R&D department tends to be much more D than R. They have a lot of development, and development would be to adapt things to work in Brazil. For example, the automotive industry have engineering departments which perform R&D, in which the D is to find out they have to raise the cars but by 7 centimeters because the potholes in Brazil are deeper, right? So it's relevant. It's not relevant. It's relevant. They sell more cars because of that, but it's not like contributing ideas to the world and making the best car in the world, right? So the challenges is that industrial R&D tends to be too incremental. They have a very weak international focus. That relates to the fact that the Brazilian economy is very closed. So companies in Brazil learned to work in a closed environment. They have a protected market. They do not have to compete too much, and they do not have to be too good, because the world is where the real competition goes on. And that makes them weak in the creation of new intellectual property, of IP. I'll jump to this just to show you the size of the effort that exists in Brazil in terms of research and development. That's data from 2011. That's your chance to learn some words in Portuguese. I just noticed I forgot some words in Portuguese in the figure, but empresas would be business sector. Business sector funds 42% of the R&D expenditures in Brazil. State governments would be the red portion at the bottom, estadual, fund 18%. And the federal government funds 38%. So that's the whole of the research funding in Brazil. The intensity of the spending is about 1.1% of the GDP, which is a weak intensity if you want to really compete in the world. It's the most intense one in Latin America, but the world is larger than Latin America. But still, for example, if you look at R&D expenditures in higher education institutions, Brazilian universities do not come badly in a comparison with China, Germany, France, UK, Canada, and other countries. So there's a lot of expenditure, which is one of the elements that makes us always think, okay, how can we make those dollars more and more effective for the taxpayer in terms of benefits to society? I mentioned to you the number of PhDs which are graduated in Brazil. This is a comparison between Brazil, which is the blue line in terms of the evolution. The vertical axis is the number of PhDs graduated every year, comparing to Japan, South Korea, and the UK and India, where you see that Brazil fares well when compared to those other countries. And this shows the evolution of the science production, the number of scientific articles with Brazilian authors in international journals, which also has been growing. This is compared to the other countries in Latin America. There is a steep change here around 2007, which is not actually real growth. It is because the database which provides this data, which is Thomson Reuters Web of Science, they in 2008 included about 200 Brazilian scientific journals in their database. So there was a jump there. I wish it was real growth, but it's not. Anyway, Brazil has done some interesting things by using research in industry associated with universities, sometimes only in industry. Here are 3 examples. Brazil became self-sufficient in energy by drilling oil in the sea, which is a program that the Brazilian government, when there was the oil shocks of the 70s, they organized a 2-pronged approach to energy. One was to find more oil in Brazilian territory, and they were lucky to find a lot of oil in the sea. And the other was to produce ethanol to substitute for gasoline. So the two things worked, and Brazil became self-sufficient in energy. Brazil produces bioenergy. In some years, Brazil uses more liters of ethanol than liters of gasoline. For example, Brazilians will not buy a car if it's not a flex fuel car. 95% of the cars are flex. And you go to the gas station and you decide according to the prices. So there's a lot of those flex fuel vehicles, and the oil program that Petrobras organized worked nicely until recently the company ran into other types of problems which do not have to do with science and technology. Then there was Embraer, which is a spin-off of an engineering school. When in the 40s, the Brazilian government, that was an interesting policy decision. The Brazilian government wanted to have the Air Force after the war. They wanted to manufacture airplanes in Brazil. So they made a decision which was, I think, right, but singular in those times. Instead of offering to a foreign company to come to Brazil to manufacture planes and this and that, what they did was to create an engineering school to educate aeronautical engineers, and that's how they brought the guys from MIT. The first rector of the school, the first president of this school was the chairman of the aeronautics department from MIT. He came to Brazil, created this, and after a number of years, the Embraer spun off from this school, which is now the fourth largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. So that's another interesting example. And of course, there is the example related to food. Brazil provides food to the world. Corn, soy, meat, all types of grain and chicken, pork. So the Brazilian agriculture in Brazil in the production of food is very, very effective, and it still is becoming more effective year by year. For example, this is an illustration of a case of university-industry collaboration. That's a project that was funded by the São Paulo Research Foundation and by Embraer. And to the right here, you see this plane which is flying here in this country, in Europe. That's the 100-seater jet plane. And the interesting thing here is that the figure on the left was in a report the PI sent to FAPESP 3 years before they had the first plane. That's when they were studying the computational fluid dynamics of the plane using researchers from University of Campinas, from ITA, from the University of São Paulo, which helped Embraer to develop this plane, which became really important, and it's really a source of funds and jobs in Brazil. Another example is, as I mentioned, bioenergy. Brazil is, I think, among the industrialized countries, probably the one that has the largest fraction of its energy renewable. 47, 46, depending on the year, 48% of the energy used in Brazil, all the energy, I'm not talking only about electricity, I'm talking about the total energy. About 40-something% is renewable. And a good part of that is because 18% of all the energy used in Brazil comes from a plant, comes from sugarcane. Brazilians plant sugarcane, harvest, make ethanol, and then plant again, and so on, using a very small fraction of the Brazilian arable land. It's like 3% maybe of the arable land, not of the lands, the country's land. So that's another interesting example of using research to do those progresses. Brazil is now, if you talk about science, building a new synchrotron light source, which is a relevant enterprise for a country the type of the development level of Brazil, which is a special type of light source that is important for industry and for research in materials research, in biology, and so on. Brazil was the first country south of the equator to build a synchrotron light source. That was back in the 90s. And now it's doing again, this is going to be a fourth generation synchrotron light source. Now so that was to give you an idea about Brazil. what we are doing and which are the challenges that happen in the country. I will spend some minutes to show you initiatives related to the state of São Paulo in Brazil, which is, as I mentioned, one of the 26 Brazilian states. It is in the southeast of Brazil. The state of São Paulo has a population of 41 million people. So in population, the state of São Paulo is more or less the size of Argentina or Spain. The economy of the state of São Paulo is such that the state of São Paulo contributes about 1/3 of Brazil's GDP, which makes the economy of the state of São Paulo larger than the economy of Argentina, almost twice as much, and slightly smaller than the economy of Spain. So it's a place where many things happen in terms of industry, agriculture, services, financial services, and so on. And in the state of São Paulo, historically, the state decided to emphasize and support higher education and research, to the point at which every year about 13% of all the state expenditures are geared towards higher education and research, which is a high percentage for a state, especially considering that in Brazil, a state is supposed to take care of the police, the hospitals, the highways, and several other things, the schools for the kids, and so on. So 13% is a relevant percentage. And in the state of São Paulo, about 1.6% of the regional GDP is what is spent in supporting research by industry and government together, which is substantially higher than what happens in Brazil, as I mentioned before, which was 1.1%. There are 3 state-funded universities in Brazil. Most of the universities are federally funded. It's different from what happens here in America. The universities are funded by the national government. The national government pays the salary of the professors, staff, and all the budget of the university. The state of São Paulo decided to have its own universities. So the state created state universities, which are now the main research universities in Brazil, because they have some favored conditions in terms of funding and in terms of academic organization and academic values that allowed them to grow better than the federally funded universities. Of course, in São Paulo, there's also some federal higher education institutions which are very important for the state. There is a network of what would be similar to the community colleges which exist here in the state. In the state of São Paulo, we have a network of between 50 and 60 of those community colleges, which have shorter higher education courses. A difference with the community college system is that in São Paulo, those schools are geared towards technology. So it's always courses related to technology of information, technology of textiles, of electronics, of navigation, and so on. 45% of the PhDs graduated in Brazil graduate in the state of São Paulo, and the state also has a network of research institutes which are mission-oriented research institutes to agriculture, to forestry, to health, technology, and so on. In the state of São Paulo, that pie I've shown before for Brazil changes. You see that industry becomes the larger funder with 61% of the total. The state funds more than the federal government, almost twice as much, which are 2 important differences which cause effects in the research landscape in the state. Just to compare, I will show to you what happens in Brazil again, here, and what happens in São Paulo. So you can tell the difference there. And then what happens in Brazil if you discount the state of São Paulo from the numbers. And then you will find out that in Brazil, companies have very weak R&D effort, which is a very important challenge for Brazil to increase that, to make industry more competitive internationally speaking. And also, in the other states of Brazil, the state part of the research and development expenditures is still small. It is growing. This figure 5 years before would have, instead of 14%, 8%. but it's still a small part of the expenditures. Just to compare the Brazilian states in terms of the expenditures they make in research with their own money, with the money from the state, not from federal money or industry money. The state of São Paulo spends 10 times more than the state which is second, which is Rio de Janeiro. And the state of São Paulo is not 10 times richer than the state of Rio de Janeiro. The per capita income is more or less the same in both states. This data translates to the fact that there is a different priority for funding research in the state of São Paulo as opposed to what happens in the other states. And another result of that is that universities in the state of São Paulo have an intense connection to industry. And that's a way I found to demonstrate that. The 3 red bars show for the 3 state universities in São Paulo what percentage of their fund they use for research come from contracts with industry. So it would be something between 5% for the University of São Paulo, 7% for the University of Campinas. And I plotted in the same figure together with the 20 universities in the United States which have the highest percentage of their research funding coming from industry. That's because around the world, people consider interaction between universities and industry in the United States as the gold standard of interaction. So it's a way to compare, which makes it clear in Brazil that those 3 universities have as intense university-industry collaboration as can be anywhere in the world, especially in the United States. So there is a lot of connections, and an important part of the effort that the state of São Paulo has for research, not the largest part, but probably one of the most important part, is the São Paulo Research Foundation. As I mentioned before, it is a public foundation which has the mission to support research in all fields. So bear in mind that it is a research foundation. It's not a science foundation. So many times in the morning, I deal with research in the arts, in philosophy, in literature, and in the afternoon, biochemistry, engineering, astrophysics. So all research fits in there. It's funded, the foundation is funded by the taxpayer in the state of São Paulo through a legislation which is the following. The Constitution of the state has an article that establishes that 1% of all state fiscal revenues belong to this foundation. And that gives the foundation a sizable degree of autonomy and stability. For example, we never have to negotiate a budget with the governor, because the Constitution gives us 1%. And actually, because as a legacy of the years in which Brazil had a huge inflation, the Constitution actually states that the government is supposed to transfer the money every month. So every month, the governor has to calculate how much money he thinks he made and send 1% to FAPESP, and the next month they make a small adjustment if they found out the number was different. And the government of the state of São Paulo has been doing this like clockwork since 1962. So I can tell you the day of the month by looking at the bank account of FAPESP. It's like, tum, tum. Twice a month they send a big chunk of money to us. And so that gives us stability too, autonomy, because we do not have to make favors to the government, right, to get the money, which I'm sure that doesn't happen here in America, but in many other places in Latin America, it works like that. And also gives the foundation stability, because, for example, if the foundation does not use the money by the end of the year, the money doesn't go back to the government. It goes into our endowment, because by Constitution it belongs to the foundation. So we have a sizable endowment that generates additional funds that we use to support research. So every year we spend in research between 120 and 200% of what we get from the government, because it's the revenues from the endowment that add to that. And of course, because it's tied to the fiscal revenues of the state, in years when the economy is bad, you lose revenue. But then you can use from the endowment to compensate for that and have some stability. That allows FAPESP to enter into programs that last for 15 years, 20 years, because we have the resources to do that. In 2014, we spent $500 million, which is a small amount compared to the amount spent here in the United States, but you have to consider that it is for one state, and also that the science and technology enterprise in Brazil is much smaller than what happens here. So that a number that will help you to assess that is the success rate. What fraction of the proposals are approved? At FAPESP last year, we approved 45% of the proposals we received, while here the NSF approves maybe 22%. NIH approves 18% or 12%, a number like that. So life is not very uncomfortable for a scientist in the state of São Paulo. FAPESP applies its expenditures. Something happened here. There. FAPESP applies its expenditures in 4 main strands. One is fellowships for students. Every month we pay 11,000 students with fellowships, and students and postdocs, including undergraduate students who receive a fellowship to work in a research project. It's what we call scientific initiations, for them to learn how research works. Many times they choose science as a career for them afterwards. Then we have what we call academic research, which is investigator-initiated research, research in which we do not tell the scientists what they are going to study. They choose the theme in their field. They send a proposal to us. Well, we have some pride in the fact that the average time for a decision at FAPESP is 65 days between receiving a proposal and sending a letter to the PI. It's a short time in terms of funding agencies anywhere in the world. So academic R&D, we fund projects which can be for 11 years. Those are centers, research centers. We have 17 of those. Then we have 5-year grants. We have 400 of the 5-year grants. Young investigators, every year we approve between 70 and 100. That's for young investigators from anywhere in the world to come to the state of São Paulo to start a career there. It's a multi-million-dollar funding for them for 4 years, for them, everything they need to start. They can choose in which university they will do it. We already brought more than 1,000 young investigators to start a career in the state of São Paulo. Then we have a program in which FAPESP associates to industry to jointly fund research. Industry puts $1, we put another $1, so it multiplies by 2. Those are some of the companies we associate with. In some cases, the grants can be 2-year grants, they can be 5-year grants, and now we started a system of 10-year grants to create a joint engineering research center between FAPESP and a company. We announced the first one last year with Peugeot Citroën from France on Center for Studying Ethanol-Based Automobile Engines. We announced another one last week with GlaxoSmithKline from the UK on green chemistry. We have 2 others coming on with British Gas on oil and gas, and with Natura, Brazilian cosmetics company, on human well-being. So it's a program that is growing. And finally, we have a program for funding research in small business, which is much like the SBIR that exists in the United States. We offer grants to a small company to develop research that will make the company more competitive. It's interesting that we compared the assessment we made of this program with the assessment NSF did. The percentage of companies that goes above $25 million is exactly the same in our program as in NSF's SBIR program. So we have a good number of companies that succeed in doing this. Well, I just want to mention before finishing that the state of São Paulo, the funding of research there has this distinct funding policy, which is both the state universities and FAPESP are funded with a fixed percentage of the fiscal revenues. And that is very relevant in Latin America because it helps you to take away the unpredictability of the funds. Because you are probably used to life here in the United States, where Congress and the government tend to have more fiscal responsibility than governments in Latin America. So if they fund something, they will make coherent things. I know that they make weird things too here. I know that, but it's nothing compared to what happens in Latin America. They might find something for 1 year, and next year they will say, okay, you get 0. And then you say, okay, so should we shut down this? No, you don't shut down. You get 0 for this year, but you might get in 3 years. So the projects become infinite projects which never end, never die, and never are concluded. So it's a different type of life that we have in Latin America as opposed to the life you have here. So having a fixed percentage is very, very relevant because it allows the administrator and the leadership to plan what they are going to do, even if it's not enough money. Because money for research, I never heard anywhere in the world saying that they have enough money for research. That's a word that doesn't apply to funding research. They always could use more. Okay, I could use more there. But the important thing, sometimes, it's more important to have stability than to have abundance of resources. Because then you know what you can do. Say, okay, I'm going to do 3 things and I'm going to do them well. And then you do that for a number of years. So the universities in the state of São Paulo, they can, for example, hire and fire professors. While the federal universities in Brazil, when they hire a professor, they never want to fire the person. The person can be very, very bad. But if they fire the person, they might never get from the federal government another place. So they prefer to stay with the weak professor than to get rid of them. While in the state of São Paulo, the president of the university can decide, okay, we don't want your work here anymore, and then the next day they can hire another person. They have a full autonomy over their budget, as the president of a university should have anywhere in the world if the university is going to work. I mean, it's not that the president decides. There is a board and everything. They have to show things and so on. So this is something that differs the state of São Paulo from what happens in the rest of Brazil. And as I mentioned, for example, the state of São Paulo has 25% of the scientists in Brazil, and they create 44% of the science which is created in Brazil. They are much more efficient than their colleagues elsewhere in the country. They supervise 40% of the doctoral theses which are concluded every year. There is an intense university-industry research interaction. There are universities which generate a large number of spin-offs. This is one case of one university, the University of Campinas. In the last 25 years, 206 spin-offs. Some of them are chronic bad cases of companies, right? They make $100,000 for 20 years every year. But some of them became companies of $300 million. For example, the one on the left there, well, somewhere, a company called Paditech there on the left column, is a company that manufactures equipment for optical communications, for WDM, optical fiber things. Now they have research labs in Israel, in Italy, and the United States. But the head of the company is there in Campinas. 2 students from the electrical engineering school started this company because they learned well the Maxwell equations and optics and fiber optics and stuff. So there are some others like this in this list. The state of São Paulo, scientists there create more articles, more science than scientists in any other country in Latin America. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela. So there is an effective operation there of research which is highlighted in good scientific journals. This is a collection of covers of good scientific magazines that highlight research funded by FAPESP in universities in the state of São Paulo in several fields. Cancer research, global change, cellular research, nanotechnology, cosmic rays, biodiversity, anything. Okay, I'm going to skip this part here, and I'm going to go to the end to mention that FAPESP has been working, as I mentioned before. One of the challenges is to develop international collaborations. Well, because international collaboration is important for research, and also because it's not natural It's not something that happens naturally for scientists in Europe or in the United States to look for partners in Brazil, because Brazil is in the southern hemisphere. It's 10 hours of flight from here. So you have to look for those opportunities. So we have been working with the scientists in the state of São Paulo to have them look for opportunities. That's a figure that shows the connections we built in the last 7 years at FAPESP in the world, with funding agencies, with universities. I do not expect you to read the small letters there, but the idea is to show you that 8 years ago, we had no dots in this figure. And now we have all those. And of course, when you look at the map, you know that everything converges to the state of São Paulo, right? So it's the most important place in the world. Anyway, we are developing those collaborations. For example, here in the United States, we have very active agreements for jointly funding research with the National Science Foundation, with NIH, and with the Department of Energy. We have a good collection of grants, large grants, like grants in biodiversity, in which we fund $5 million, NSF funds other $5 million for 5 years for the guys to study the biodiversity of the Atlantic rainforest or the Amazon or whatever. And telescopes, we just entered into this great Giant Magellan telescope program. Those are real. It's not just collaboration in which scientists travel and spend one week there. It's doing science together. It's not exchange. It's working together in a research project for 5 years to fight for the results, fight for the acceptance of the articles, and then teach the students and interact, really interact in doing research. So I will stop here by just adding that if you want to follow what's going on in research in Brazil and in the state of São Paulo, this is a very easy way to do it. We have a news agency that sends this newsletter every week in English. You can just subscribe every week. Actually, we send every day in Portuguese to more than 100,000 subscribers in Brazil and in Latin America. And by the end of the week, we make a special number with some of the subjects there in English to send worldwide. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to comment and answer any questions.